first Buddhist women, these early heroines who gained enlightenment. We know about them through an early Buddhist text called the Therigathas. And these are the verses, the poems of the wise of the elders. And in the text there are 73 poems and 73 songs of awakening. And there are different women of all ages and social backgrounds. There are queens and servants and prostitutes and courtesans and housewives and mothers and wives and truth seekers from all kinds of backgrounds. They were all disciples of the Buddha. And the Buddha's view towards women was quite remarkable for its time. So at the time there was this Brahminical view was around that women should do nothing independently, even in their own house. Yeah, so in childhood they were subject to their father. In youth they were subject to their husband. And when the husband was dead, they were subject to their sons. They should never enjoy independence. Women were expected to be wives and mothers. And I was just thinking about the situation in Afghanistan at the moment. I mean, I think in India, actually it was better, you know. It was even better at the time there to what is happening there in Afghanistan right at the moment. But that's sort of like, maybe even in Europe, you know, a few hundred years ago, that was not so unusual, the role of women in society. But if there was nobody to be dependent on, they became outsiders of society. It was a very dangerous and unsafe life. Often they were seen like prostitutes, you know, if there was nobody to be dependent on. And at the time, there were already a few women who became female wanderers. So there was a whole tradition. Actually, the time in India, there was quite a bit of prosperity. So a lot of men were seeking the truth. They were going out and trying out in different ways how to sort of like free themselves from suffering. So there was a whole tradition which shows that there was quite a sort of like certain level of prosperity in the region. But there were also a few female wanderers before the Order of the Nun was started. They were truth seekers, but it was quite unusual. There was another tradition starting right at the same time as Buddhism started, the Jains, which was nearly a little bit similar to Buddhism. Their founder was Mahavira, but they had a few women. But there, in that tradition, there actually were two different groups, and one thought that women could gain enlightenment, and there was another group which thought they can't. Yeah. So the first people who followed the Buddha into homelessness were actually men. But through the help of a woman called Mahaprajapati, who was the aunt of the Buddha, but also his foster mother, and Ananda, the Buddha's cousin, after some time also women were allowed to go forth from home into homeless life. Vishwapani is one order member here in our Buddhist movement, and he wrote a book called The Life of the Buddha. And there he says, Gautama the Buddha was certain that women could gain realization, so could gain enlightenment. And he may have been the first teacher ever to regard women as spiritual equals in this respect. So the Nun Sangha was a radical experiment for its time. So very early on at the beginning of this Nuns Sangha, the women became shamanis, female wanderers. They would live in the forests under a tree, which is a very dangerous thing to do. I mean, even today, I don't know if I would live in the forest under a tree. Not only because of wild animals, and definitely India had wilder animals than we have here in Germany. They were outsiders of society, outside of the protection of men, and there was always the danger of being raped. They were sometimes called the shaven-headed horse, treated as sexually available. And one of these is Shupa. which means bright. So that's her name, Shuba, the bright one. She's shining or beautiful. And instead of marrying, she became a shamani. So this is very early on in the tradition of the nuns' order. And she liked to go walking alone in the woods, dwelling at the foot of a tree, meditating and reflecting. So one day, while she was walking in the lovely Jivakamba woods, there was a rogue villain, it says, sort of like a man approaching her, and he stopped her. And she said, "What wrong have I done? Why are you standing in my way? It is not right to touch a woman who has gone forth into homelessness. I live without blemish, in purity, so why do you block me? Your mind is out of control, full of passion, but I am serene. My passion is gone. I am clear, and my mind is free in every way. Why do you block me?" And the man says, "You are young and innocent. What will leaving home do for you? Throw away your saffron robe. Come, enjoy the flowering woods. Sweetness falls from all trees. Flower pollen whirls all around. The beginning of spring is a time of joy. Come and enjoy the flowering woods. What pleasures will you have if you go alone in the woods? If you want to go without a companion into the lonely, huge, frightening forest where savage animals live, come, live in a house with me, in the calm of a palace. Let women serve you. I will dress you in gold, pearls, and precious stones. Climb onto a bed of fragrant sandalwood." So he's quite good, isn't he? Sort of like trying to tease her into coming with him. Maybe he's not as rude as it sort of like looks, but she just says, "This fragile body is full of death and headed for the grave. What you see on value here that makes you stare at me, you are out of your mind." And he just says, "Your eyes like those of a doe. They excite me. They are like the bud of a blue lotus, pure, shining. Your long eyelashes, your pure gaze. No eyes are dearer to me than yours." And he just goes on and on. And she just says, "You're heading down the wrong path. You want the moon as your toy. You are chasing the Buddha's child. There is nothing in heaven and earth that I want. I don't even know about desire. What is it? It is like a bowl of poison to me. Try to seduce someone who hasn't seen this and hasn't sat by a teacher. But if you try this one, you will end up frustrated. My attention is unshaken by joy or pain, or praise or blame. I know there is no happiness in anything born from a cause, and I cling to nothing. Blind man, you are chasing an empty thing and illusion. A tree of gold at the end of a dream, a puppet show in a crowd. An eye is just a little ball in a socket, with a bubble in the middle, tears, secretions. Then Shuba plucked out her eye and said, "Here, take the eye," and gave it to them. His passion died there and then. And he said, "Make yourself whole again, religious woman. This won't happen again. Coming up against you is like embracing fire or grabbing a poisonous snake. Make yourself whole again. Forgive me." And then he let her go, and she went to the Buddha, and seeing him, her eye was restored. So this is mythical, isn't it? But I mean, gosh, what a woman, you know. What a woman, her determination, her things, how she saw it, you know, how she could stand there. And what a convincing thing. I don't think she took out her eye, but maybe she, I don't know what she did. So this is a bit of a mystery. So, So there is a reading from the Therigathas, and the quote number 1. I've got Amy here as my lovely assistant so that you hear another voice as well. And she's a very good reader, so I thought I'd just take her. So this is, I think, the first one. Yeah.
This one.
Reading number 1. No, reading number 2. No, sorry, I've got confused. No. Okay, that was already on. So this was the reading, sorry. So Shubha encountered something hostile. She did not run away, or she didn't fight. She reacted totally different. He met calmness and fearlessness. His hostility, his greed got nothing to feed on. What a shock for him when she plucked out her eye, coming up against you like embracing fire. One can feel a bit sorry for him, and that he met this state of mind which is unshakable. Nothing can stand in her way, and she totally destroyed all his false illusions. But some other women, they actually they encountered more violence, living alone. So the rules were changed after a while, and they were only allowed to go out in twos. Actually, the men, it changed as well. They were also only allowed to go out in twos. It could also be there was an accident or something on the road, you know, where you, I don't know, you fell or something, and it was good to have a companion with you. And so they were still quite early on going from village to village like the monks, and collecting alms, accepting whatever they got given as food. And later on they lived in kind of monasteries, but it was very, very simple. You know, just a few huts and made out of bamboo or out of, I don't know, twigs and something. So they had no belongings except their robe, their begging bowl, a water filter, a needle and thread, and the women had a hip string for their menstruations. But so many talked about the freedom they experienced. You hear their cries of victory. There is not a lot of teaching in the texts, I have to say, but all have this spirit of, I've done it. I've plucked out craving, roots and all. I have removed fear from my heart. The massive darkness is torn aside. And they all had their reasons to go forth into the homeless life. For some of them, there was a lot of dukkha, pain. Some of you might know the stories of Kisagotami or, what's her name? Patachara, yeah. And sometimes the pain was so big that there was no other way forward. They were at the brink of madness. They were disillusioned with life. For others, it was a longing, yeah. After they had maybe heard the words of the Buddha or met him. And others were already on the search for truth. And that's probably a bit similar to all of us. You know, some of you might be here because there's quite a lot of pain in your life and you're just reflecting on, so what's this life about? And for others, you've seen maybe somebody or came in contact with somebody and there's a longing for something they've got. So maybe you're just sort of like searching for truth in a more general way anyway. So now I come to Amy, yeah. So Vishwapani quotes Catherine Blackstone, who studied the verses of the nuns.
Vivid insights into their lives come from the post-realization verses of the Therigatha, which Catherine Blackstone calls the only canonical text in the world's religions that is attributed to female authorship and focuses exclusively on women's experiences. Both the Therigatha and the discourses testify that many nuns gained realization, enlightenment, and felt confident in their capacities. Blackstone's study of the Therigatha concludes that The nuns had a distinctive approach to Dharma practice. While the monks' verses value peacefulness and quietude, the woman's path to enlightenment was fraught with difficulties that must be faced. And while the monks stress detachment, the women's lives after awakening show a transformation of their emotional response to others. For one thing, they no longer needed men. When Mara appeared before one nun, she declared that men are in the past for me. I do not grieve, I do not weep, and sir, I am not afraid of you.
So Mara is sort of like a mythical figure, like the personification of everything which stands in your way towards gaining enlightenment. So I'm not afraid of you anymore. We can say that, each one of us, men and women, when doubt comes in or temptation comes in, just say, I'm not afraid of you, Mara. But it's quite interesting, isn't it, that the woman's path is full of difficulties that must be faced. So there is this sort of like slightly different approach, how probably men and women, most men and women, go about the spiritual life. And there's a transformation of their emotional response to others. So it's sort of like, it's much more collectively. So how did this order of the nuns come into being? So it all starts with Prajapati. So at her birth, an astrologer foretold her that she would be a leader of a large following. So she was the daughter of a king, or of a leader at the time. And she was called the leader of a great assembly, which is quite unusual for a woman. And later she became Maha Prajapati. Maha means great, so a great leader of a great assembly. So she was not from the Shakin clan, she was from a different clan, sort of like which lived close by. And she became the foster mother of the Buddha. Siddhartha's own mum died. She was called Maya, and she was the sister of Prajapati. And she died just a few days after the Buddha was born. So the sister, Prajapati, his aunt, she stepped in, and she became the second wife of King Suddhodana. So she breastfed Siddhartha, and she brought him up like her own son. And after Siddhartha had left the palace, it was not easy, yeah? The king was so disappointed and hurt and annoyed that the future king, all his hope, had just left, yeah? So he was just gone out in search of truth, and there was no sort of like person to follow up. And for several years, no one heard anything about Siddhartha. But then rumors reached the palace, and miraculous stories. And they said that Siddhartha had become a Buddha, an awakened one. And Prajapati, she took the first opportunity there was to see her beloved son. Again, secretly she left the palace to see Siddhartha, and at least from the back of the crowd, she was there to listen to him. And what she saw and heard really changed her life. She realized she had heard the truth. And she reflected on what she heard, and she started meditating. And after a while, actually, the Buddha came back, and he had contact with the whole of his family, and most of them actually also followed him. His father became a lay follower, but also his son became a monk. And Prajapati also had a son called Nanda, and they just talked about what they heard. They sort of like had these conversation about the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha. But one day Nanda was gone, her own son. He had also followed the Buddha. He became a renunciant, a monk. He had gone forth into homelessness. And Prajapati could understand that he did it, but she was left again, She was just left home again. But over the next months or the next years, this was not the only case. More women appeared at court saying that their husband and son had actually gone forth into homelessness. So it's quite interesting. A lot of people just responded when they heard the Buddha. You know, they sort of like went forth. A lot of young men, quite a lot of people from actually the Shakyan clan. They were cousins of the Buddha. They just went forth into homelessness. They wanted to sort of like realize the same what the Buddha had sort of like realized. And that caused a little bit of trouble. At some stage, you at the beginning you could just leave. You could just leave your family. But then people were saying they can't just go. They need the permission of either, you know, their fathers or sort of like people who were looking after them. So that changed. They need the permission of their parents to actually leave into homelessness. But there were a lot of them who left, and they were gathering, you know, at that palace of Suddhodana, the king, and Prajapati. And then the king died, and then really the place became a place of refuge for the women. First just the relatives, but then also all the courtesans from these two harems, from Siddhartha and from his father. They also stayed there, and then there were peasants, wives of merchants, and they all had lost their husbands to the Buddha. And at the same time there was a war going on. It was about some rights for water, and quite a lot of the people also went to war and were killed. Until the Buddha actually sort of like stepped in and pacified them all again. So the palace was filled with women and kids, 500 of them. It's a number they use a lot. 500 means a lot. And it had become a refuge for them. They were looking for protection, for advice and support from Mahaprajapati. They were looking for answers. How shall our lives continue without the identity and security of a man? Quote number 2. This is also from Susan Murcott, which I think is a really lovely book called First Buddhist Women, Poems and Stories of Awakening. I can post that in the link later. I really liked it.
Others came to resolve ultimate questions of birth, suffering, and death. Yet others sought a new family with women they trusted and with whom they shared common experiences. The longing of these women, whatever form it took, became their spiritual aspiration. All had personal stories, most of which are now lost, and a particular experience of what the Buddha called the first noble truth. This is what motivated them to join with Prajapati in the new and radical way she was about to suggest. Prajapati recognized the powerful conjunction of events and people. An old and influential woman without further worldly obligations, she was surrounded by displaced wives, widows, consorts, dancers and musicians. Lacking other kin, these women were turning to her and to one another. Having fully grasped this situation, Prajapati decided to take the following course, recounted in the Kula Vaga.
Mm-hmm. So Amy, you keep it, because you're just going to read us what's going to happen there, which is a version of the Pali canon.
The occasion was this. The Buddha, the Blessed One, was living among the Shakyans in Nagroda's park at Kapilavastu. Maha Prajapati, Gautami, went to him. She paid homage and stood at one side. Then she said, "Lord, it would be good if women could obtain the going forth from the house life into homelessness in the Dhamma and discipline declared by the Perfect One." Enough, Gautami. Do not ask for the going forth from the house life into homelessness for women in the Dharma and discipline declared by the Perfect One. She asked a second and a third time and was refused. Then she thought, the Blessed One does not allow it. And she was sad and unhappy. She paid homage to the Blessed One and departed, keeping him on her right. Now when the Blessed One had stayed at Kapilavatthu as long as he chose, he set out to wander by stages to Vesali. When he eventually arrived there, he went to live in the hall with the pointed roof in the great wood. Meanwhile, Mahapajapati Gautami had her hair cut off and put on the yellow robe. With a number of Shakyan women, she set out for Vesali. On arrival there, she went to the hall with the pointed roof in the great wood, and she stood there outside the porch. Her feet were swollen, her limbs covered with dust, and she was sad and unhappy, with tears on her face and sobbing. As she stood thus, the Venerable Ananda saw her. He asked her, "Go to me. Why are you standing outside the porch like this?" Lord Ananda, it is because the Blessed One does not allow the going forth for women in the Dharma and discipline declared by the Perfect One. Then, go to me. Wait here till I asked the Blessed One about this. The Venerable Ananda went to the Blessed One and told him what had happened. And he said, "Lord, it would be good if women might obtain the going forth from the house life into homelessness in the Dharma and discipline declared by the Perfect One." Enough, Ananda, do not ask for the going forth from the house life into homelessness for women in the Dharma and discipline declared by the Perfect One. He asked a second and a third time and was refused. Then he thought, the Blessed One does not allow it. But suppose I ask the Blessed One in another way. Then he said, "Lord, are women capable, after going forth from the house life into homelessness in the Dhamma and discipline declared by the Perfect One, of realizing the fruit of stream entry or once return or non-return or arahantship?" They are, Ananda, capable. If that is so, Lord, then since Mahapajapati Gautami has been exceedingly helpful to the Blessed One, when as his mother's sister she was his nurse, his foster mother, his giver of milk, she suckled the Blessed One when his own mother died. Since that is so, Lord, it would be good if women could obtain the going forth. Ananda, if Mahapajapati Gautami accepts 8 capital points, that will count as her full admission. Thank you very much.
So this is the story which is mainly told how the Order of the Nuns came into being. And it's very interesting, over the last years there have been more and more books coming out, and this is a sort of like a book called Daughters of the Buddha by Bhikkhu Analayo, which he is a scholar and really goes into research. And he found out that actually there were 2 versions of the Pali Canon coming through China. So at some stage, the sort of like the texts, when they were written down, were also brought to China. And in India, some of it got lost, but somehow in China they remained. So he saw that actually the first request of Mahaprajapati, when she asked the Buddha to become a nun, was not totally refused. And he said, you could shave your heads and wear your robes, but you can't go forth. So they could have lived as nuns in their own vicinity, yeah? So they could shave their head and sort of like live that life, but not go forth, not go into homelessness, which I thought was quite interesting. And also, when you read this text, and Ananda first sees the nuns coming, he doesn't give any comment that they're wearing robes or have shaven their heads. Just imagine 500 women appearing here in golden robes and sort of like shaven head. Wouldn't you comment on it? So he's not commenting on it, and the Buddha also doesn't comment on it. So it looks like he didn't refuse them totally, but sort of like gave them a sort of like a possibility of how they could practice. But the going forth itself was just too dangerous, as I said before. Just these women are living under these conditions. And also the order was still quite young, yeah. So there was already quite a lot of resistance towards the men who had gone forth and left their families. And now all these women going forth, I mean, what would that mean to a society? So these 8 extra rules, you could see them sort of like the main rule is actually that the oldest nun, they might have been practicing for 20, 30 years, is under the authority of a young monk who maybe just been, it's his first day, of being a monk. So that was the rules. And you could see this as sort of like a way of sort of like being under the authority, the women still being under the authority of men. But you could also see that because they stepped out into this homelessness and wanderers, they needed some protection, that they were under the protection of the whole order of the monks, which gave them a little bit more security. So, thank you, Analayu, for bringing things out like this. There's more and more books appearing, so we will see. But in this in this version of the Pali canon, Ananda really brought out the principle. So, women can attain the fruit of stream entry, once returner, non-returner, and full enlightenment. Yes, they can. And it's quite funny, isn't it, that we still, I've mentioned this quite a lot in this talk, that women can do that. That in itself is quite interesting. I had never heard a talk where the guys had to prove that they can gain enlightenment. But, yeah. And Ananda, he he pressed a bit further that Mahaprajapati was the Buddha's foster mother, giving him milk. And that's also interesting. We are indebted to our parents, even if we don't really like them, but we are indebted to our parents for giving us life and bringing us up. And that's, in some ways, still a very strong point at with all the things which might have happened to us, there is an indebtedness to our parents. So that's how the Bhikkhuni order, the order of the nuns, came into being. And Prajapati was the first Bhikkhuni nun, and she just then brought the order of the nuns together. And they practiced wholeheartedly the Dharma. And later she also gained enlightenment, as many of her sisters, and she looked after the others, she taught them the Dharma, and it is said that she died at the age of 120. So I don't know if this is myth or whatever. But she had that determination, the courage to stand up for her convictions, for her longing and for her values, against all odds, against all convention. And I'm really indebted to Mahaprajapati. Thank you, Mahaprajapati. But I wanted to look a tiny little bit into her verse. So in the Therigathas, there are all these verses. You could say they're sort of like after they gained enlightenment, the Buddha had quite a lot of udanas, where sort of like just a verse flows out of him. And sometimes when we are on retreat, suddenly we have to write a poem, which sort of like maybe describes much better what happened to us than sort of like writing it all sort of like a bit systematically down. It's sort of like an expression of something which happens. And her verse is, "Homage to you, Buddha, best of all creatures, who set me and many others free from pain." So this is gratitude, and that's a quality of enlightenment, this deep gratitude. And then come 3 verses which are much more about her realization. "All pain is understood. The cause, the craving is dried up. The noble eightfold path unfolds. I have reached the state where everything stops. I have been mother, son, father, brother, grandmother. Knowing nothing of truth, I journeyed on. But I have seen the Blessed One. This is my last body, and I will not go from birth to birth again." Look at the disciples all together, their energy, their sincere effort. This is homage to the Buddhas. Maya, her sister, gave birth to Gautama for the sake of us all. She has driven back the pain of the sick and the dying. So that's her verse. And I think I'm going to do something which hasn't really been done here before. Maybe you could just pass on these little verses. And if you want, on the retreat we had recently, I did a chant. I sort of like, a friend of mine said, "Why don't you make a mantra for Mahaprajapati?" But I felt like, oh, that's a bit too much, yeah? But what about using part of her verse? "All pain is understood, the cause, the craving is dried up. The noble eightfold path unfolds. I have reached the state where everything stops." So in the next verses, she goes a little bit into it, like she's been cycling through samsara. If you come into the door here, there is this big wheel of life. And we are driven by greed, hatred, and delusion. And it's a bit like being in a hamster wheel. We're just repetitive, going around there. And the Buddhist or the spiritual path is about getting out of the wheel, out of that turning, so that we reach a state which is, it's not that everything stops, but it's sort of like that greed, hatred, and delusion is stopping. And there's a different quality coming in, which is spontaneous, which is free, which is full of compassion and love, full of wisdom, where we have seen how things really are. So, I'm just going to sing the verse, and if you want, you could join in. And then I think after 7 times, I just let it stop. And hopefully get the bell in. And the chant just came to me, which I've never done before. Yeah. All pain is understood, the cause, the craving is dried up, the noble eightfold path unfolds. I have reached the state where everything stops, all pain is understood, the cause, the craving is dried up, the noble eightfold path unfolds. I have reached the state where everything stops, all pain is understood, the cause, the craving is dried up, the noble eightfold path unfolds. I have reached the state where everything stops, all pain is understood, the cause, the craving is dried up, the noble eightfold path unfolds. I have reached the state where everything stops, all pain is understood. The cause, the craving is dried up, the noble eightfold path unfolds. I have reached the state where everything stops, all pain is understood. The cause, the craving is dried up, the noble eightfold path unfolds. I have reached the state where everything stops, all pain is understood. The cause, the craving is dried up, the noble eightfold path unfolds. I have reached the state where everything stops,